In the early 1930s, the United States military was operating under a stubborn, almost delusional rule of aviation. All military aircraft had to be biplanes. The generals believed that stacking two wings on top of each other made a plane stronger, safer, and cheaper. The idea of a fast, single-wing monoplane was considered a dangerous commercial fad. Because of this old-school conservatism, America's bomber force in 1930 was an embarrassing fleet of slow, canvas-covered dinosaurs that looked like they belonged in World War I. Then, a company named Martin decided to build a system error. They ignored the military's demands. They ignored the old rules. In complete secrecy, they funded and built a bomber so radically advanced, so aggressively modern, that when it finally took to the skies, it didn't just beat the competition, it made every single fighter plane in the US military completely obsolete overnight. This is the story of the Martin B-10, the mechanical masterpiece that literally rewrote the book on how bombers were built, and forced fighter pilots to realize they were suddenly the slowest guys in the sky. When Martin delivered their prototype, the Model 123, to the Army Air Corps in March 1932, the generals must have thought a UFO had landed on the runway. There was no canvas, there were no wooden struts, there were no messy support wires. The plane was a sleek, all-metal cantilever monoplane. The wings and the fuselage were covered in a stressed aluminum skin. It looked like a silver bullet. But the real cheat codes were hidden in its design. Before the B-10, bombers carried their massive, drag-inducing bombs strapped to the outside of the fuselage. It ruined the aerodynamics. Martin built the very first internal bomb bay. The bombs were tucked inside the belly behind closed doors, keeping the plane perfectly streamlined while also keeping the explosive fuses safe from the weather. They also added mechanically retractable landing gear. Instead of dragging heavy wheels through the wind, the wheels folded up into the wings. To power this heavy, all-metal beast, Martin bolted on two brand-new, unproven 600-horsepower Wright Cyclone engines. When the test pilots fired up the engines on a freezing Ohio morning in 1932, the results were staggering. The massive bomber didn't just fly, it rocketed to a top speed of 197 miles per hour. After a few months of aerodynamic tweaks, including a wider wingspan and an engine upgrade, it returned to the test field and shattered the 200 miles per hour barrier, hitting 207 miles per hour. To understand how earth-shattering 207 miles per hour was in 1932, you have to look at what the good guys were flying. The primary fighter aircraft of the US military at the time was the Boeing P-12. It was a biplane. Its absolute top speed, if the pilot pushed it to the absolute limit, was 189 miles per hour. The military had just purchased a massive, heavy bomber that could literally outrun the small, nimble fighter planes designed to shoot it down. If a B-10 decided to drop its bombs and fly away, the US military physically did not have a plane capable of catching it. The old generals were silenced. The Martin B-10 forced the military to accept that the era of the biplane was dead. The Army Air Corps immediately ordered 48 of them. However, the B-10 still had one hilarious, glaring flaw from the old era. When it was first tested, the pilot and the gunners were sitting in completely open cockpits. Imagine flying at 200 miles per hour at 15,000 feet in an open convertible. The crews were absolutely freezing, and the wind was deafening. After some very loud complaints from the men actually flying the planes, Martin finally enclosed the cockpits in sleek, glass-house canopies. They also installed the very first fully enclosed rotating gun turret ever put on a US military aircraft, sitting right on the nose. The B-10 was a sci-fi spaceship for the 1930s. It was so fast and so capable that it became a massive point of American pride. In 1936, a group of B-10s flew a massive multi-leg journey from Virginia all the way to the Panama Canal, just to show the world that American air power could reach anywhere on the map. Because the B-10 was so revolutionary, the rest of the world wanted it. Once the US Army's orders were filled, Martin started exporting slightly modified versions, known as the Model 139, across the globe. They were sold to Argentina, China, Thailand, Turkey, and the Netherlands. The Dutch loved it so much, they bought 121 of them for their forces in the East Indies. But aviation technology in the 1930s was moving at a terrifying breakneck pace. The B-10 was the undisputed king in 1932, but by the time it actually saw real combat in 1937, it was already becoming a dinosaur. In China, 5 B-10s were used to bomb invading Japanese forces. They were effective, but they were quickly wiped out by the sheer numbers of the Japanese military. The true brutal test came in the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, when Imperial Japan invaded in 1941. The Dutch used their massive fleet of B-10s for coastal patrols, anti-submarine warfare, and high-altitude bombing. But the Japanese had arrived with the A6M0, a fighter plane that could fly 330 miles per hour. The B-10 was no longer the fastest thing in the sky. It was now the slow, vulnerable prey. The Dutch fought bravely, using the B-10s to slow the Japanese advance across Sumatra. But the combination of lethal Japanese fighter planes and intense anti-aircraft fire decimated the fleet. By the time the Allied forces surrendered in Java in 1942, almost every single B-10 had been shot down, destroyed on the ground, or captured. Back in the United States, the B-10 was quietly retired as massive four-engine behemoths like the B-17 Flying Fortress took over the skies. Martin built over 340 of these revolutionary bombers. But today, despite being the aircraft that literally dragged the US military into the modern era, only one single B-10 survives. It is an export model that was operated by Argentina for years, eventually donated back to the US, and it now sits as a silent ghost in the National Museum of the US Air Force in Ohio. The Martin B-10 is often forgotten because it didn't win World War II. It didn't drop the atomic bomb, but it was the crucial missing link of aviation. It was the plane that proved that metal was better than canvas, that one wing was better than two, and that if you built a bomber smart enough, you could make the fighter planes look like absolute fools. It laid the DNA for every famous American bomber that would follow, including Martin's own legendary B-26 Marauder. The B-10 didn't fight the biggest battles, but it completely rewrote the rules of the war to come. If the story of the Martin B-10 and the death of the biplane changed how you view aviation history, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that the unsung mechanical marvels of the past deserve to be remembered. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into the archives. What do you think? Did the military hold on to biplanes for too long? Or were they just being cautious with taxpayer money? Let us know in the comments below.